Hey. Okay, it's been a long day, but I wanted to wrap up this trio of original Jamestown settlers. Let's tackle Sir Francis Wyatt. Now, normally I would just start at the point where your ancestor reached America. That's usually my starting point. But in this case, I think the ancestors beyond this were kind of interesting. So Sir Francis Wyatt, as we've already briefly discussed, was the first governor in the Virginia colony. But his great-grandfather was Sir Thomas Wyatt, who was born in 1503. Sir Thomas Wyatt was a poet, and he's credited with introducing the sonnet to English literature. His father was Privy Councillor to Henry VII, and his father was still a trusted advisor when King Henry VIII ascends to the throne in 1509. Now, King Henry VIII, I'm sure everybody knows by now, he's the one who killed all his wives. King Henry VIII, the father of Queen Elizabeth. Just watch that show, The Tudors, if you want to bone up on it. So, anyway, Sir Thomas Wyatt spends his childhood following his father to court during this time, and then he ends up studying at Cambridge. But Sir Thomas Wyatt was said to be a very handsome man. He stood at over 6 feet tall, and he was very strong and fit. And there's pretty strong evidence that as a young man he had an affair with Anne Boleyn. Now, this was before her marriage to King Henry VIII. And there's no evidence that they had an affair after she was married to King Henry VIII. But in any event, Thomas Wyatt ends up getting thrown into the Tower of London by Henry VIII for allegedly committing adultery with Anne Boleyn. But this is the time when Henry VIII is trying to get rid of Anne Boleyn, and he's just throwing everything at the wall, So Thomas Wyatt ends up getting released from the Tower of London later that year, but while he's in there, Anne Boleyn would be beheaded, as would 5 other guys that supposedly committed adultery with Anne Boleyn. Probably didn't, but it's possible that Thomas Wyatt witnessed all of these executions from his prison window. He would later write poetry about it, but so he manages to get out of that situation. He ends up dying at the relatively young age of 39 of an illness, but not before he manages to have 3 sons. And thank God he did, right? Or you wouldn't be here. So he ends up having 3 sons. His son, Sir Thomas Wyatt the Younger, would lead something that was called Wyatt's Rebellion in 1554. So this is an uprising to overthrow Queen Mary I because she had decided to marry Prince Philip of Spain. And so this uprising, Sir Thomas Wyatt the Younger leads this uprising to overthrow Queen Mary I and replace her with Queen Elizabeth, Henry VIII's daughter. It fails. His uprising fails, and he's executed, beheaded, and quartered, and his head's hung up somewhere, and his arms and legs are sent out to distant counties to show that this is what happens. The queen would take away all of his land and titles, but just a mere 4 years later, Queen Elizabeth ends up coming to power, and she restores all of the Wyatt lands and titles. So 30 years later, Sir Francis Wyatt is born. So he's born in 1588. Sir Francis Wyatt's born. He attends Oxford, and he's knighted at Windsor in 1618. And shortly thereafter, he gets appointed as governor of the Virginia colony. And he heads over there in 1621. And remember, he heads over there with Claiborne, another of your ancestors. And he's governor when the Jamestown massacre occurs. And he oversees a contraction of the colonies at this point because there are all these kind of scattered outposts. And so after the massacre, which occurred up and down the colonial frontier. He pulls them all in to just sort of make a defensive corps. And he also organizes, during his term there, he organizes the first General Assembly of Virginia, which we discussed before, which is the first legislative body in America. He leaves office a few years later. He heads back to England because his father's died, and so he handles his father's estate, where he then meets another of your ancestors, remember, Richard Henry Lee, and he's Sir Francis Wyatt's appointed governor again, asked to be governor again, so he heads back over to the colonies in 1639, I believe it is, and 1639, and he heads over this time with another one of your ancestors, Richard Henry Lee. And after serving a few more years over in Virginia, he heads back to England, where he dies in 1644. His daughter Elizabeth would end up marrying a man named Christopher Garlington, and they would marry in England, and they would come to Virginia, which starts that. So even though there are no direct descendants that are named Wyatt that came from Sir Francis Wyatt, his daughter marries Garlington, and they come together to Virginia. Okay,